Right now, as you watch this, the geography of Western Canada is physically rewriting itself. What happened on the Howe Sound corridor of British Columbia was not some isolated rockfall on a remote logging road. This was a systemic, deep-seated ground failure of such staggering magnitude that it is currently unzipping one of the most critical economic arteries in the country. This is not a slow geological crawl. It is a catastrophe happening in real time, and the data coming from Natural Resources Canada suggests that what we are seeing is only the beginning of a much larger tectonic settlement. When you first look at the aerial surveys from the RCMP helicopters, your brain struggles to process the geometry. It looks like a natural canyon that has been there for millennia, a jagged vertical drop of 30 meters cutting through the coastal forest. But that canyon did not exist 48 hours ago. This is the Porteau Ridge mass wasting event, a landslide front stretching nearly 4 kilometers along the steep slopes between Horseshoe Bay and Squamish. It is moving through a saturated coastal mountain face directly above the sea-to-sky highway and the CN rail line. The scale of this movement has effectively paralyzed the Pacific Gateway. The ground didn't just buckle, it migrated, carrying an entire section of the mountainside toward the Strait of Georgia. In its wake, it has pulverized a multi-million-dollar bridge, twisted heavy-gauge steel rails like they were made of wire, and severed the primary link that British Columbia depends on to move commuters, tourists, and essential freight between the lower mainland and the interior. The first catastrophic failure manifested on the afternoon of April 2, 2026, when the bridge spanning the Britannia Creek on Highway 99 underwent a total structural collapse. The Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure had already flagged the route for closure due to extreme rainfall, but the speed of the failure outpaced the deployment of barricades. This was the moment the beast, as local geologists have begun calling this slope, finally woke up. The sheer volume of displaced earth, estimated by the Geological Survey of Canada to be in the millions of cubic meters, has created a displacement zone so wide that it is visible from low Earth orbit. We are witnessing the failure of a coupled system, where the weight of an entire mountain, lubricated by record-breaking atmospheric rivers, has finally overcome the friction of the underlying glaciomarine sediments. This is no longer a question of if the road will be repaired, but if the ground beneath it will ever be stable enough to support human infrastructure again. The clock is ticking for the communities isolated north of the break, and as the sensors continue to register deep-seated movement, the realization is setting in. The landscape has won, and our engineering is failing. At 9:30 a.m. on April 7, 2026, the digital pulse of British Columbia's infrastructure flatlined. Deep within the asphalt of the sea-to-sky highway, fiber optic strain sensors and embedded GNSS stations began reporting data that defied standard engineering tolerances. We weren't looking at surface erosion or a routine rockfall. We were witnessing a tectonic scale displacement of the quaternary glaciomarine sediments that underpin the Porteau Ridge. This was the moment the beast truly bared its teeth. The chronology of this collapse is a masterclass in geomorphological inevitability. While the public's attention was fixed on the tragedy of April 2nd at the Britannia Creek Bridge, the Geological Survey of Canada, GSC, was already tracking a far more existential threat. 5 days prior, the bridge on Highway 99, the main artery between Vancouver and the Olympic Corridor, had simply vanished into the swollen torrent of the creek. The road had been officially closed hours earlier due to an extreme atmospheric river event that had dumped 180 millimeters of rain in 36 hours. But the physical barrier hadn't stopped two vehicles from attempting the crossing. One truck, sensing the vibration, accelerated and cleared the span. The second, driven by 53-year-old Marc-André Lefebvre of Prince George, was lost as the concrete abutments were sheer forced away by the moving hillside. His daughter Sophie would later release a heartbreaking video from the staging area in Squamish, pleading for search and rescue crews to continue diving into the debris-choked waters even as the slope above them continued to groan. It was a grim harbinger of the systemic failure to follow. By the morning of April 7th, the failure had expanded from a localized bridge collapse into a regional corridor severance. At 9:32, real-time kinematics from Natural Resources Canada, NRCan, showed a sudden horizontal offset of 12 centimeters at the Porteau Cove monitoring station. Simultaneously, the sea and rail corridor, which hugs the shoreline beneath the highway, reported a critical track deformation. Maintenance crews found that the heavy-gauge steel had been physically displaced by 10 centimeters, not by a strike from above, but by the ground moving beneath the ballast. The entire coastal shelf was sliding. Dr. Elena Vance, a senior geophysicist with the GSC, described the mechanism as a deep-seated rotational failure within the glaciomarine clays. These are old seabed sediments, she noted in a simulated emergency briefing, remnants of the last glacial retreat. They are incredibly porous, and when saturated, they lose their internal shear strength.
We are seeing a high pore pressure event, where the water effectively acts as a lubricant on a basal sliding plane located 60 meters underground. This technical reality meant that the highway, the railway, and the critical fiber optic telecommunications lines were all resting on a massive moving raft of earth. The closure was immediate and absolute. The sea-to-sky was shut down from Lions Bay to Squamish in both directions. For the first time in modern history, the primary land link to the northern coast and the interior via the Duffy Lake Road was cut at its most vulnerable point. Public Safety Canada warned that the situation was extremely complex, noting that the landslide front was still moving at a rate of 3 to 5 centimeters per hour. In the command center, the mood was one of suppressed panic. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with bulldozers and gravel. You cannot rebuild a highway on a surface that refuses to stand still. The mayor of Squamish, echoing the fears of thousands, referred to the hillside as the Beast, a dormant giant that had been documented by provincial geologists as far back as 1906. Historical records from the BC Ministry of Transportation showed at least 15 major reactivations over the last century, almost always following the 550 mm threshold, a cumulative rainfall index over 180 days that signals the saturation of the deep clay layers. That threshold had been crossed in mid-March 2026. The data was there. The warnings were in the reports, but as the ground began to flow, the gap between scientific foresight and infrastructural resilience became a chasm that threatened to swallow the regional economy whole. To understand the true scale of the Porteau Ridge failure, we must look at the dark lineage of Canadian geological disasters. This is not the first time the West Coast has seen the Earth turn to liquid, but it may be the most expensive. In 1965, the Hope Slide, Canada's largest recorded landslide, saw 47 million cubic meters of rock pulverize a valley, burying a section of the Hope-Princeton Highway under 70 meters of debris. But while the Hope Slide was a sudden, catastrophic rock avalanche, Porteau Ridge is a silent killer. It is a deep-seated flow, moving with the relentless, grinding inevitability of a glacier, fueled by the unique and treacherous geology of the British Columbia coastline. The science of this failure lies on the quaternary glaciomarine clays, often referred to in geological circles as sensitive clays or Leda-type sediments. These are the remnants of ancient seabeds deposited when the weight of the last ice sheets pushed the continental crust below sea level. As the ice retreated and the land rebounded, these salt-laden sediments were exposed to fresh water, which slowly leached away the ionic bonds holding the clay particles together. This leaves behind a house of cards structure. It is stable when dry, but the moment it becomes saturated, the structure collapses. The clay doesn't just get wet, it undergoes thixotropy. It physically transitions from a solid to a liquid state. According to reports from the Geological Survey of Canada, the Porteau Ridge has been a documented hazard
since the early 20th century. Historical data from 1906, 1954, and 1996 show a clear pattern of cyclic reactivation. Each time, the trigger was the same: prolonged, high-intensity rainfall. The Natural Resources Canada Technical Archives had already established a critical threshold for this specific hillside: 550 millimeters of cumulative rainfall over a 180-day window. That number is the tipping point where pore water pressure at 60 meters depth overcomes the internal friction of the clay layers. Before April 2026, we knew this number. We had the sensors. We had the history. Yet, we continued to build and rely on a corridor that was effectively a bridge over a slow-moving river of Earth. This is the failure of a coupled system. It is the collision of a changing climate, manifesting as the hyper-intense atmospheric rivers that now batter the Pacific Northwest, and a geologically fragile landscape. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, PBO, and the Insurance Bureau of Canada have long warned of this imbalance. Between 2010 and 2023, Canada spent an estimated 46 billion Canadian dollars on disaster recovery and infrastructure repair, while only roughly 19.2 billion Canadian dollars was allocated toward proactive mitigation and hydrogeological stabilization. We are, quite literally, spending twice as much to fix the wreckage as we are to prevent it. The beast of Porteau Ridge fits this logic perfectly. In 2021, the British Columbia government announced a design tender for slope consolidation, valued at 40 million Canadian dollars. Engineering firms proposed an advanced drainage system consisting of gravity-fed wells and permanent horizontal inclinometers to bleed the water out of the slope before it could reach the critical failure pressure. However, in a tragic parallel to administrative delays seen nationwide, the formal construction tender, the request for proposals, was only published in December 2025. By the time the Landslide reactivated in April 2026, the project existed only as a stack of blueprints in a Victoria office. No heavy machinery had arrived. No drainage wells had been bored. The money was in the budget, the engineering was sound, and the hazard was mapped with surgical precision. But while the bureaucracy moved at the speed of paperwork, the mountain was moving at the speed of physics. This is the paradox of the modern Canadian corridor. We have the world-class science to predict our downfall, but we lack the institutional velocity to outrun it. The human reality of the Porteau Ridge collapse is a study in isolation and escalating logistical terror. This isn't just about a broken road. It is about the severing of a lifeline for over 50,000 people living in the sea-to-sky corridor. By the evening of April 7, 2026, the scale of the economic blackout began to crystallize. Arjun Singh, a logistics director for one of the largest shipping firms operating out of the port of Vancouver, describes the scene at the rail yards as a slow-motion train wreck. With the sea and rail line physically warped by the migrating slope, the primary artery for grain, potash, and timber heading to the Pacific Gateway was cut. We have 4,000 rail cars currently staged across the prairies with nowhere to go, Singh noted in a simulated situation report. Every hour the Porteau Ridge stays active, the Canadian economy hemorrhages an estimated 140 million Canadian dollars in lost trade. This is a continental-scale bottleneck. But while the economists counted the dollars, the residents of Squamish and Whistler were counting their remaining supplies. Sarah Tremblay, a veteran search and rescue coordinator based out of the Squamish station, describes the psychological toll of the beast. On the night of April 8th, her teams were tasked with the emergency evacuation of 25 households in the Lions Bay North development, where the ground had begun to exhibit an echelon cracking, jagged, stair-step fissures opening in people's backyards. You could hear it, Tremblay says, her voice strained in recorded transcripts. The mountain doesn't move silently. It groans. It sounds like heavy machinery grinding underwater. We had families living with nothing but what they could carry, walking toward the helicopters because the roads had already buckled into impassable ridges of asphalt. The isolation was nearly total. With Highway 99 severed and the backup routes through the interior, Highway 1 and Highway 5, already under extreme pressure from secondary slide events, Squamish became an island. Local grocery stores reported cleared shelves within 6 hours. The University of Northern BC's satellite research centers and local schools across the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District were shuttered indefinitely. Public Safety Canada coordinated with the Royal Canadian Air Force to begin Operation Lifeline, a series of CH-147 Chinook sorties delivering fuel, medicine, and food to the stranded northern communities. The infrastructure failure was not limited to the pavement. As the beast moved, it took the region's nervous system with it. The primary fiber optic backbone, buried alongside the railway, was sheared by the shifting clay at a depth of 10 meters. This triggered a massive telecommunications blackout across the corridor, disabling emergency dispatch systems and cellular networks. For 12 hours, the only communication out of Squamish was via satellite link and ham radio operators. Simultaneously, a secondary landslide triggered by the same rain system at Fury Creek pulverized a critical water main, leaving thousands of residents without potable water. Jean-Philippe Desjardins, a regional director for Public Safety Canada, summarized the crisis in a blunt briefing. We are looking at a multinodal system failure. You have a landslide at Porteau Ridge, a water main failure at Fury Creek, and 94 provincial roads across British Columbia currently closed due to hydrogeological instability. This isn't an event anymore, it's a regional siege. The beast had effectively cut the province in two. In the midst of this chaos, the personal story of the Lefebvre family became a national focal point. The search for Marc-André Lefebvre, whose vehicle was swallowed by the Britannia Creek collapse, had to be suspended 4 times as the upstream slope threatened to bury the recovery crews. His daughter Sophie remained at the edge of the exclusion zone, a haunting figure against the backdrop of the churning, debris-filled Howe Sound. Her plea, "Don't let the mountain hide him," became the rallying cry for a province grappling with the reality that their engineering was no match for the deep-seated physics of saturated clay. The ecological fallout was equally staggering. The slide had pushed thousands of tons of sediment into the sensitive rockfish conservation areas of Howe Sound, choking the marine environment with silt and potentially destroying decades of habitat restoration. The total damage to infrastructure, rail rolling stock, and emergency response costs was projected by the BC Ministry of Finance to exceed 2.8 billion Canadian dollars, not including the long-term economic drag of a fractured supply chain. At Porteau Ridge, the ground continued to creep at 2 centimeters per hour, a slow, relentless reminder that until the beast decided to sleep, no amount of money or political will could force the corridor back together. The silence on the sea-to-sky was total, save for the sound of the rain and the mountain moving toward the sea. The beast of Porteau Ridge remains awake. As of late April 2026, the movement has not ceased. It has merely transitioned into a more insidious, rhythmic phase of creep. Fabio Ciciliano's counterpart in the Canadian context, the Director of Emergency Management BC, issued a statement that carries the weight of a death sentence for the current corridor. Until the landslide achieves a natural state of repose, restoration of the sea-to-sky infrastructure is a physical impossibility. You cannot build a foundation on a liquid, and you cannot anchor a bridge into a mountainside that is still searching for its bottom. The engineering reality is that the internal pore water pressure within the glaciomarine clays remains at critical levels. The water trapped 60 meters down does not simply drain away when the rain stops. It lingers, keeping the clay in a state of suspended cohesion, where the slightest vibration, even from construction equipment, could trigger another catastrophic surge. This is the grim new normal for the Canadian West Coast. The Porteau Ridge failure is not an isolated geological fluke. It is a sentinel event. It exposes a wider national pattern of hydrogeological fragility that is now colliding head-on with our aging infrastructure. While the eyes of the nation are on the sea to sky, Natural Resources Canada reports that the stability of the entire Trans-Canada corridor is under siege. In the interior, at Salcedo-equivalent locations like the fragile slopes of the Fraser Canyon, multiple secondary failures have already forced the evacuation of rural communities. A landslide near the Rocos-Pinalveti parallel of the Coquihalla summit has severed the main interior water and gas lines, leaving thousands in the Okanagan Valley without reliable utilities. The numbers tell a story of systemic underinvestment in prevention. According to data analyzed by the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, in 2023, Canada has spent roughly 46 billion Canadian dollars over the last 13 years reacting to hydrogeological disasters, while less than 20 billion Canadian dollars was directed towards the engineering required to prevent them. We are caught in a cycle of catastrophe and patchwork, where we paid double to fix the wreckage of a hazard we already documented decades ago. The Porteau Ridge stabilization project was budgeted at 40 million Canadian dollars. The economic fallout of the corridor's closure, the total loss of the Britannia Bridge, and the paralysis of the CN rail line are now projected to exceed 5 billion Canadian dollars. The mess of delay is a mess of ruin. In 2021, the atmospheric rivers that devastated the Coquihalla and the Sumas Prairie were seen as a once-in-a-century wake-up call, but the 2026 Porteau failure proves that the century is moving faster than our bureaucracy. The most damning line in this entire tragedy is also the simplest. The formal tender for the Porteau Ridge stabilization works was published in December 2025. The landslide reactivated in April 2026. For 4 months, the money was there. The engineering designs, a sophisticated network of drainage wells and permanent GNSS inclinometers developed by firms like Technital, were finalized and sitting on a desk in Victoria. The hazard was understood, the threshold was calculated, and the beast was mapped. What was missing was the actual construction site. The machinery was still in the yard when the mountain began to move. As we look toward the next few years, the data suggests this is just the beginning of a larger tectonic and climatic recalibration. The coupling of record-breaking precipitation with a landscape that is geologically unzipping means that every major corridor in the Canadian Cordillera is now a potential point of failure. From the port of Prince Rupert to the shipping hubs of the St. Lawrence, our infrastructure was built for a climate that no longer exists, and a geology we assumed was static. The Porteau Ridge landslide is still moving. The cracked remains of the Britannia Creek Bridge are still being pulled into the Sound. The emergency funds have been unlocked, and the Operation Lifeline helicopters continue their grim shuttle. But the corridor remains broken. The lesson of Porteau Ridge is that in the fight between institutions